Hello, my name is Grandin Gill, and this video is the third video in a series of 6 that talks about how to structure different types of papers. And this video is really intended for individuals who do not do a lot of paper writing and are a little intimidated by the blank page. Obviously, if you're an experienced researcher, you've got your own structures. In this particular video, we're going to talk briefly about one of the different types of case studies. There are really 2 general categories of case study research. One is the case study that tests, qualifies, or extends existing theory, and the other is the exploratory case study. And so they're different enough, so I decided to create 2 separate videos, and the exploratory case study can be found in video 4. But for now, we'll focus on case studies that do fairly traditional types of research, such as testing theories or determining the limits of theories. Just as a quick review, in part 2, I introduced what I refer to as the LIFO structure for creating a paper. And I was given an introduction to this structure from my colleague, Gigi DeVreda, who deserves all the credit for it. But what it basically notices is that the typical paper structure consists of parts that sort of wind up the paper and then unwind the paper. And we tend to unwind in the reverse order of the winding. So it's basically like a last in, first out stack. In practical terms, this means that if you start with an introduction, you're going to raise issues that position the paper and are resolved and discussed in the conclusion. Your background section, which differs according to the type of paper, is going to get resolved in your discussion section, and this is where you talk about the contribution. Where a method section is appropriate, the method section is resolved when you present your results, and we call this how you execute the research. And in almost all the paper structures that I will be discussing, and there are 6 in the series, we will use this basic approach. Now, this approach is very formulaic. If you've written lots of research papers, you can come up with your own approach to presenting the papers, but this series is really designed for people who have not written a lot of research papers and are looking for a reasonably mechanical way of getting started. The testing case study has a structure that's very, very similar to the sort of generic paper that was covered in part 2 of this series, and also pretty similar to the empirical research study. So I'm just going to quickly summarize the different sections. As per the LIFO method, in the introduction, you're going to set up the problem you're looking at. Why is it interesting? And in the conclusions, you are going to essentially respond to issues that were raised in the introduction, drawing upon the knowledge that you learned in analyzing the case or series of cases that are described in the research. Your background sections come pretty close to the standard background sections of an empirical research paper. You present the problem context, and this is going to be resolved in the discussion section when you talk about implications for stakeholders. You conduct a brief literature review. Normally, if you're using case studies, the literature review is going to be fairly limited. The reason that you're going and doing cases is because you can't really answer your questions in the literature. So you don't have to necessarily go into tremendous detail. You may or may not have a series of hypotheses or propositions. If you're doing theory testing, that may be a convenient way to present what you're trying to do. If you're doing theory building or theory expanding, you may content yourself with the kind of research objectives or research questions that might be raised in the introduction or the problem context. The method section is very, very important for research cases, and chances are you're going to be referencing RKN's case study research, which is one of the most cited research products in the entire social sciences. You will need to present a research design, and very, very often case research will involve more than one case. I characterize a number of different patterns. There's a single case design that could be used perhaps to show the limits of theory. Single cases are much more commonly used in exploratory research, which is covered in part 4 of this series. You can have multiple case designs, which I call replication designs, where you choose 2 or 3 or a small number of cases specifically for their characteristics. In replication design, very often if you can find 2 very superficially similar case sites that have very different outcomes, that tells you that whatever theory you're using is not going to generalize very well. On the other hand, if you can find 2 very superficially dissimilar case sites that have similar outcomes, then that suggests the theory may be more generalizable. I first used this particular approach when I was doing case research piece on Mrs. Fields cookies and Battery March financial management. It would be hard to find 2 more dissimilar industries, and yet both of those companies experienced a pattern of very, very rapid success, followed by almost equally rapid decline, and that allowed me to sort of expand a theory about what happens in complex environments. You also want to talk over the data gathering and analysis protocols, because these are going to be very important in convincing people of the rigor of your case. Because remember, in case research, you're generally not going to be able to use statistical testing to support your arguments. You are going to have to show that you made all sorts of efforts to avoid bias and other things that would interfere with your results. The narrative section of case research is where a tremendous amount of the meat is. If you're dealing with a single case or a very small number of replications, then the narrative will probably tell the story of each case. And in all likelihood, it may be interrupted from time to time as you highlight issues that were raised in the problem context, the background sections. And so you can go back and forth in many cases between your narrative and discussion. You can also tell the whole story for each case, whether it be one case or a small number of replications, and then you can synthesize that in the discussion section. I've seen both. Either one of them is fine. It really is going to depend a little bit on the situation, how interesting the narrative is, how complicated it is to tell. Now, if you move into a larger number of cases, I sometimes refer to these as pattern designs. Chances are you're not going to have the ability to do an in-depth narrative of each case. And in that case, what you'll probably do is you will use things like tables to summarize the characteristics of the cases you analyzed. It's still case research, but nevertheless, what you're trying to do is detect patterns that are interesting. If you get enough case sites, and I had this happen in a research I was doing relating to expert systems, if you've got enough case sites, then you may even be able to do some rudimentary statistical analysis to demonstrate how likely or unlikely the pattern is and what forces might be producing that pattern. There you sort of skirt the boundaries of case research and empirical research, and you might even be better off using the empirical research template for that type of paper. But again, it really depends on the context. At any rate, we still have the same LIFO pattern: introduction, resolved by conclusions. The background sections tend to be resolved by the discussion. The narrative resolves the method. However, the narrative and discussion are more likely to overlap in this type of research than any other type of research. And so you may end up having something that's a little bit more complicated than the LIFO pattern when you do case research with a lot of replications. Well, thank you for listening, and feel free to look at the other 5 videos in this series. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email address is grandon, that's GRANDON, @usf.edu. Once again, grandon @usf.edu. Thank you very much for watching.